the interview is just going to consist of your time at Atari, and I guess I wanted to start out with after and again, if I get any facts incorrect, I thought I did some pretty good research, but if I happen to get a fact incorrect or a date wrong, please feel free to correct me because I don't want it to go out wrong. I don't want so. But
No problem there.
no problem on correcting me. After you received your master's at Tulane, how did you end up at Hewlett Packard, and what was your job?
The way I wound up at Hewlett Packard was I had done some interviewing at Tulane in New Orleans with a variety of companies. One of the companies who interviewed me was Hewlett Packard's desktop calculator division in Colorado. And they decided I wasn't really a good fit for them, but they decided I would probably be a very good fit for their networking division, which was in Cupertino, California. So they sent my resume to the people in Cupertino, California. And those people then contacted me directly, flew me out for an interview, and made me an offer the first day I was there. I just had a bunch of interviews one day, and then they made me an offer, and I accepted that. There it was. I was all set, from graduate school to go right to California and start working as a multi-terminal systems engineer was the job title. It was networking. It was in the early days of networking.
I guess networking in the 70s.
Yeah, in 79.
Yeah. After that, what circumstances led up to you working at Atari?
Well, I was really, really bored at HP, and I was really bummed. I was very unhappy because the joy that I had found from doing microprocessor computing and real-time control stuff, which was fascinating to me, was not really happening. I was working on mainframes and just connecting mainframes to webs and things like that, which was just, it may sound interesting, but it really was not a particularly compelling style of programming. And so I was looking around, and then I found out about Atari. What I found out about Atari was that it was a wild environment. That's what I had heard. So I went and I pushed my way into an interview in there. And then I interviewed there for a little bit, and they thought I was too straight to work there. They thought I wouldn't fit in at Atari. But I literally begged and pleaded with them, and ultimately they gave me a shot. I took a cut in salary, and I went on probation and started working at Atari. And then after I'd been there a little while, they realized, as I did, that this was really a very good fit. That I was somebody who was definitely made to be a game engineer at Atari, and everything took off from there.
There is some urban legend I heard that there were about only 50 people in the world who knew how to code and program those Atari 2600 games. Is that about accurate?
Yeah, early on.
Okay.
It was very complex stuff. It was very complicated to do, and there weren't many. I mean, this is the dawning of microprocessors, right? So in the first place, there weren't many people who knew how to program microprocessors, period. Then of those, there were very, very few who had ever been exposed to the actual hardware from the TIA chip, which was the adapter that would connect the microprocessor to the TV and enable it to drive a TV signal. And then of those, there weren't that many who could actually make a fun game after you get through all that other stuff. So it was actually a very small cadre of people who could actually produce anything like a decent game on the 2600.
Did you already know how to work with those microprocessors when you got there, or was there some on-the-job training?
No, I had actually done a fair amount of microprocessor programming in college. I was in a very sophisticated program in college, and it was very unusual to have microprocessor experience, and just like it was very unusual to have networking experience in college. But I was actually in a fairly unusual program with some unusual people, and it turns out I was kind of an unusual guy myself.
Well, from conception to, I guess, final product, explain what the process was from just getting a game started and then completed during that era.
It's kind of I mean, you come up with a game idea, and then you start coding it, and then you put up the basic rudiments of the game if you can, and then you start playing the game, and now it's an iterative process of playing and tuning and playing and tuning and playing and tuning to improve the game, or coming up with new mechanics, or deciding what does and doesn't work in the game, and then deciding how you're going to improve those or retune those or reapportion or readjust them to improve the game.
During that time, you were basically like, or an individual programmer was sort of almost the only person really working on the game, compared to today where you have like 200 people at least working on a game.
Oh yeah, no, I thought that was understood. Yeah, when I got to Atari, that was it. A programmer did a game. The big revolution occurred just shortly after, within months of my getting to Atari. They hired a woman named Marilyn Toyer, who happened to be the wife of Dave Toyer, who was in Coin-Op, who had done games like Missile Command and Tempest. And Marilyn Toyer was an artist. And this was the first time in the history of gaming that an artist was hired to try and improve graphics on the game. So that was the first time anyone other than the primary programmer was actually working on a game. And then a little while later, within a year later, we actually got a sound person to help out with some sound. And so I never really availed myself. No, I did on ET and Raiders. I got a sound person to do the tunes. I never really put together the music for games, but I always did my own sound effects and a good deal of my own graphics. But Jerome Demura did a lot of the graphics on my games once I got to Raiders. In Raiders, he only did the animation for Indiana Jones, and ET, he did the graphics for the whole game. So basically, we added graphics people, we added sound people, but it was still just one programmer. You didn't start seeing multiple programmers on a game until you got to like Sega and Nintendo platforms and stuff like that.
How did the idea of Yars Revenge and even the title come about?
Well, the title for Yars Revenge is a great story. Because it's a story, because, I had a master's in computer engineering, but before that I had a bachelor's in economics and math. And I had much more of a business sense than did many of the programmers there. So I sort of pulled my own little marketing thing, because what I decided was, once Yars started to shape up to be a pretty good game, and it wasn't Yars yet, it was just the game. And once that looked like a good game, I really wanted my first game to be a game of note, a significant thing. I wanted everything about it to be cool and the best it could be. And when they started coming up with potential names for it, they were all extremely lame, and I didn't really care for the marketing plans. It didn't sound very interesting to me. So I asked if I could make a submission and do something like that, and I found out yes, I could. But they was running out of time. So I sat down and started thinking, okay, what do I want to call it? How do I want to name the game? I tried to make up names because I was very excited about this, right? I was very excited about this because this was an opportunity for me to add a word to the English language, which was something I always wanted to do. And if I could come up with a name for what this character was, and if the game became very popular, then the name of that character would just become, a common word like Pac-Man, right? So I started to think and make up something. I couldn't really think of anything that sounded interesting to me. So then I thought, if I can't just come up with something, blindly make it up, let me think of an algorithm, right? Some method for naming it. And then I started to think, well, Ray Kazar, who was the CEO of Atari at the time, well, Ray spelled backwards is Yar, and that sounds kind of cool. And Kazar spelled backwards is Razak, and I started to think, okay, well, I don't know what Razak is. And then I started to think, what would make the name even stronger would be to have a story to go with it, because nobody had really done a backstory for a game. And so I thought, well, why don't I just make up a whole story behind what the scenario of the game is, and that'll enhance the name. That was all just something to make it stronger to get the name in. And so I stayed all night, and I wrote up like a 7 or 8 page like sci-fi story about the scenario of how Yars came to be, and they were just earth flies that had mutated through space radiation and turned into these monsters, and then took over their own solar system, and then there's some other monster that came to get them, and that's the Kotile. And so this whole story that created the scenario for all the characters. And so I submitted that. So what I did was I gave the submission to the product manager. I said, hey, I got his name, and here's a story, too. I got a story to go with. He goes, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, you know. And I said, okay, so go put this in, and he put it in. And the next day he comes around, and he says, I said, so is it in? Is it in for consideration? He goes, yeah. And I said, okay, have they decided yet? And he goes, no. And I said, look, I said, I'd like to tell you a story. I said, I'm going to tell you a little secret, but I don't want this to impact the, the selection process. And I want that to be fair. He goes, yeah, okay. I said, if I tell you a secret, you swear to keep it to yourself, not share it. He's like, yeah. And so I said, okay. So I said, in the Yars game, it's, Yar, what's that spelled backwards? And he thinks of everything. He goes, Ray. And I go, right. Yeah, and it's in the Razak solar system, right? Razak. You know what that is backwards? He thinks about it. He goes, oh, Khazar. He goes, oh, Ray Khazar. He goes, you named this from Ray Khazar? I said, yeah, I did. I said, but that's why I don't want anybody to know that. He goes, does Ray know about this? And I said, well, of course Ray knows about this. He said, it wouldn't be something like this without Ray's knowledge. I said, but that's why I don't want it to be unfair. I don't want it to influence the process. He goes, oh, okay. And so I said, so you swear you won't tell anybody? He goes, yes. He goes, I promise, absolutely. Okay, so he took off. And at that point, I knew a few things, right? One, I knew he would run right back and tell everybody in marketing, right? Two, I knew that nobody in marketing would have the balls to go and actually talk to Ray about it. And three, I knew that was a really good thing because Ray knew nothing about this, right? I just made all this shit up. So the next day he comes, he goes, hey, Howard, guess what? I go, what? He goes, we're going to go with Yars Revenge. We're going to go with Yars. I said, oh, that's great. That's fantastic. And I thought it worked exactly like I planned it. He goes, in fact, we're going to make a comic book to pack out with the game that's like about the storyline. And I said, well, there you go. That's fabulous. Because that was, Yars Revenge was the first game. There was a lot of firsts in Yars Revenge, as we had talked about. And we talked about Yars probably, right? But one it was the first game with a backstory. It was the first game with ancillary story and equipment and stuff like that. It had a comic book and all this other stuff. It also was the first game to have credits, right? It was the first Atari game to go out with credits. Because it had the comic book and had this other stuff, they decided, okay, well, it would be time to give credits and stuff. And then they showed me the credit list, and I noticed that they had credited me with doing the game, but they credited someone else with writing the comic book, and I had written the story. And I said, then why didn't I get credit for the story also? And they said, look, Howard, you can only have one credit. Would you rather have credit for the story, or would you rather have credit for the game? So I said, well, I will take credit for the game. That's okay, and that was fine. But it was just funny. This is the kind of stuff that went on. So that's how Yars Revenge got its name.
How did Ray Khazar actually feel about that whole backstory? Was he flattered by it?
Well, he ultimately did hear about it. I wasn't in touch with Ray all the time, of course. But there was, months later, there was a press event where we were demoing games for the press, and I was there, and Ray was there, and I was demoing Yars Revenge on this giant big screen TV when big screen TVs were brand new. You had the projection TVs, and so that was pretty cool. That was the biggest TV I ever played Yars on. And I was there playing the game, and Ray comes up, and he looks at me, and he goes, I heard what you did about the name for this game, Howard. I said, oh, I said, yeah. I said, well, what'd you think about that, Ray? He goes, just keep making games, Howard. You just keep making games. It was kind of an interesting moment with Ray. Ray was an interesting guy.
You mentioned the comic book. Also, I remember that the Sword Quest games had some comic books. Was the Sword Quest idea with comic books come from the Yars Revenge comic book?
Possibly. I mean, Yars Revenge was the first game to ever do that. So once that happened, the people in marketing thought, well, let's find other places we can do this, and it's a way to enhance our product. So it became a very popular idea with stuff. The Sword Quest series, the idea of doing a series with prizes and events and building that was an idea that was a product of March brainstorming in '81, where some people had kicked around this idea of making like a series and doing something and see if we could get Warner on board to supply some grand prizes and make it a big focus, a big precedent. And then that eventually became the whole series, and Todd Fry was the guy who ended up designing some of the basic games and programming some of the games as part of the series.
Also, you mentioned...
But yeah, I mean, the idea of doing a comic for that and stuff, the idea of a comic came from Yars originally, when they saw how people got kind of excited about the comic and there was a story behind it.
You mentioned how Atari doesn't give credit to the programmers, which they really didn't at the time. But some of you guys, yourself especially, sort of snuck in your little signatures in the games. Do you want to explain how you guys did this and sort of what it's what the idea has become today with Easter eggs?
Well, I mean, how we did it was everybody did it their own way. It was just hiding something in the code somewhere. Because nobody went through and reviewed the code to see if you have anything like that in there. There was nobody that sophisticated to do that who wasn't one of us, right? And nobody even ever asked anybody to do it. But originally, Warren Robinette was the first one to do that in Adventure. There's that thing where you can ultimately get to a place in Adventure where it says created by Warren Robinette. And the reason he does, because the reason those things evolved is because Atari didn't give credit, didn't want to credit programmers for the games, because they were worried that if people found out who did the games, they would get the people who did the better games and try and buy them away, right? So for them, it was like competitive protection. But to us as programmers, there was the issue of like, so you do this game, you do this interesting technical product, and then later on, someone says, "So what have you done?" You say, "Well, I did this game," and they go, "Yeah, well, prove it. How do we know you did this game?" And so the idea was, you want to put something in the game that no one but you knows how to find that identifies you in the game. Because no one would put someone else in their game that way, right? So that was the way it started originally. It was a secret. And I did have a secret signature Easter egg in Yars. But then I talked with marketing once about the idea of, we could do this, and what we could do is make it something that's not such a secret and let people know there's something like that in there, and it can become an extra piece of gameplay, right, that people try to find the signature. And, what's up with that? And that to take something that was originally a way of being able to claim credit for your work and turn it into a marketing hook for the game and something that increases the play life of the game. So that's something that I did, because I had, what Yars was not the first Easter egg, it was not the first signature in a game, but it was the first marketing approved and integrated signature of the game. And the point of the signature in Yars, which is HSWWSH, is not just my initials, but it's my initials and my initials backwards, which tells you that what you want to do is you want to think of Yar backwards and Kazar backwards, or Razak backwards, and that's how you figure out one of the secrets of the game, which was that it was named for Ray Kazar.
Were you one of the only programmers that had sort of a marketing or business background? Because you've mentioned that a couple of times, and I was aware of it, but it seems like that business marketing background really sort of enabled you to focus your efforts on other aspects besides just programming.
Yeah, and there were no other programmers who were really like that. I mean, I think I was pretty much, there were at Atari. There were other programmers who had bigger ideas about what constitutes an interesting thing to put in a game or how to increase gameplay and stuff like that. But I don't think there was any other programmer who had like degrees in non-technical or business fields. I'm pretty sure of that.
Well, okay.
And who'd actually studied other things, and but to me it was just more interesting. It was interesting. I didn't look at it. Most of the programmers back then looked at making a game as a technical exercise. Okay, I looked at making the game as an entertainment exercise. Okay, and it was an entertainment business. And so that was the perspective that I kind of brought to it. That may have been a little different than what some programmers did when they first sat down to make a game.
Were you saying that programmers weren't, or at the time weren't really looking at the entertainment value and more sort of the technical, I guess, challenge?
Well, everybody looks at it as an entertainment thing ultimately, because if your game isn't fun to play, then you really haven't accomplished anything, right? So it's not a game if it isn't fun to play. But most people looked at it as purely a technical challenge and tried to say, what can I do to make the most technically intricate or advanced thing that I can do on this system? That's the way some people would approach the game. I did not look at I did some, I think, technically innovative and intricate things here and there. But my focus wasn't trying to maximize the technology of the system. My focus was trying to maximize the game experience and the player enjoyment in it. And you don't necessarily have to maximize the technological capacity to maximize the game experience, and vice versa. Two examples I would give. I mean, there are plenty of really sophisticated, very involved, super graphic games that are out that just don't play very well. They're not very compelling games, right? And you look at something like Tetris. There's a game that could be done on the 2600, could be done on any system, right? Tetris is an easy game to implement on any system. It doesn't challenge anyone technically, but it's a fabulous game, right? The game itself is very compelling and addictive, right? So you can focus on the technology, or you can focus on creating a game experience. And sometimes those are the same, but sometimes they're different. And when they were different, I tended to focus on the game experience more than I focused on the technology.
Well, how did you get involved with the Raiders of the Lost Ark game?
Well, Yars had come out, and Yars was a big success. And so Yars positioned me as one of the key players at Atari, right? When Yars came out, because Yars was also the most tested game in history, in the history of Atari, certainly. I mean, because there was someone at Atari who kind of wanted to kill Yars for whatever reason. They kept asking for test after test and saying, because they said there's a problem with it, and we have issues with the game, and there's a problem with the game, and most people didn't really see a problem with the game, and most of the people in management never played the game. They didn't do anything with the games, right? They were just managing. So, they didn't really have any sense of game. So someone would tell them, oh, well, there's an issue, there's a problem. Oh, well, what are you going to do? So they would test it. So Yars Revenge became the most tested game in history, and it also, by the end, when the smoke cleared, it set records in all the testing. The final test they went through was a play test, where you have 100 people come in, and they play the target game, and they play a control game, and they rate both of them, right? And so they did one of these play tests on Yars Revenge, and the control game, the test game they wanted to test it against, was Missile Command for the 2600. I thought, holy shit, they're trying to kill the game, right? Because they're putting this up against the best game on the 2600 at the time. But by the end of the weekend, Yars Revenge beat Missile Command in the play test. It actually tested hotter than the #1 game on the system. Okay, so at that point they got rid of the person who was trying to kill the game. And they released the game. But by the end of that, it had basically earned me the reputation of someone who's obviously a serious contender in terms of people who can make good games on the 2600. So then, when it came up with the opportunity for, we got the rights to do Raiders of the Lost Ark with Spielberg, who are we going to get to do it? So they came to me, and they said, well, you want to do Raiders of the Lost Ark? And I said, well, sure, that'd be kind of fun. And then they said, okay, well, Spielberg has to approve the programmer for that. So I had to fly to L.A. and do an interview with Spielberg to see if he felt I was a person who should do his game. And we had a really interesting time together. And by the end of it, I had called him an alien, and he decided I was the one who should do the game. So then I did Raiders. I actually got quote of the month in Games Magazine for calling Spielberg an alien.
Do you think that's what inspired E.T. the movie?
No, it was, the thing was, when I was talking with him, I told him, I said, Steven, I said, I have this theory that you're an alien. I said, would you like to hear it? And he, of course, he goes, yeah, I'd love to. This after we had chatted for a while, and I showed him Yars. I demoed Yars for him. He was playing Yars, and we're talking about things in general. Really, Gilbert's a pretty cool dude. And we were having a very fun conversation. So I told him, here's my theory. And I just told him that I thought that, when we discovered aliens, and in the early 80s, it really seemed like alien contact was imminent. It really seemed like we were about to get there. And so I told him, I said, look, when the aliens are going to come to Earth, I said, they're smart enough not to just show up like in the movies in their spaceship and land and go, hey, everybody, here we are. I said, they're going to know that we're kind of a funky people, and they're going to want to culturalize us. So they'll send an advanced team. They'll send a group of people here to do something to culturalize and prepare the planet to meet aliens in a peaceful and positive way. And so I said, the way I figure it is, Spielberg was one of the first people to do serious movies where aliens are not threatening, where aliens are friendly, and they're getting together with us as opposed to threatening us. And his movies became super popular, right? And were seen all over the globe in virtually every language. So I said to him, I said, what I figured was he was the production arm of the advanced team where he makes these movies. Because what better way to culturalize Earth than to produce media about something and disseminate that and get everybody thinking along those lines. So he makes movies where aliens are positive, and then the people in his marketing arm make sure that these movies become super hits that go everywhere on Earth. And that's what they did. And so I just said, so that's it. I think he's part of the alien advanced team culturalizing the Earth, and he really liked that. I think he really enjoyed that thing. And I really kind of believed that until he did War of the Worlds. When he did the remake of War of the Worlds, I figured, well, I guess, that ship has sailed.
Playing the game Raiders myself, it actually, I believe it was wasn't it the first, I guess, movie-based game?
It was the first movie conversion. It was the first time a game was done from. Tron had been a movie that was done from a game before then, but this was the first time a game had been done from a.
You got cut off there a little bit. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Something weird. Just my phone just buzzed. Yeah, it was the first time a game was being done for a movie.
And I guess it made it a little bit of a challenge, but the game is pretty faithful to the movie story, including little bits you did where you put the staff in the room and it lights up a certain way. Do you know if Spielberg? Exactly. Do you know if Spielberg actually liked the game?
I don't think Spielberg ever played the game. Spielberg didn't have a lot to do with the games that I made from his movie. What would happen is occasionally he would come up to Sunnyvale and we would have lunch together and we would chat and I'd show him a little bit of this and that with the game. He really didn't have much to do with the games at all. He was a pretty busy dude. He made over $1 million a day through 1982. That was a good year for him.
I guess so.
He was pretty busy with his own stuff, but occasionally he would come by and we would chat and stuff. But what did happen was at the end of when I was finished with Raiders, and this was in June in '82, and we were coming up to this. Back then there was the Consumer Electronics Show. They didn't have E3, right? There was the Consumer Electronics Show, and that's where all the video game stuff was. And the Consumer Electronics Show back then was twice a year, and it was in January in Vegas, and it was in June. It was January in Vegas and June in Chicago. Okay, so we were coming up to that CES, and they wanted. So what we did was, I went to a studio. I went to a film studio, and what we did was we made a video of me playing through the game. So I made a video of a playthrough of Raiders Lost Ark where I sat down, played, and narrated the game. And it was probably the only time, we did it in one take. It was probably the only time ever that I played perfectly right through the game and narrated the whole thing along the way. It was just amazing. I don't think I could ever have done that again. But it just was magical. It just worked. So I did this whole thing, a playthrough. I played through the full game perfectly, all the way through, finished the game. And to actually play the whole game and just run through and do all that takes about 12 or 14 minutes. That's all it takes, just run through Raiders.
Especially
So,
if you know how to do everything.
Right. That helps. And so, because an adventure game is about learning how to play the game, not just running through the game. So I got that together, got this videotape together, and I practically handcuffed the videotape to my arm because I wanted to show this to Spielberg. So we got to Chicago, and I'm running around the tape, and eventually he shows up at the Atari booth, and here we are. So we go upstairs in the special room, and we plug it in, and I play the tape for him, and he just watches the tape. Now, I am a huge movie fan. So for me to hang with Spielberg in the first place is like an amazing opportunity. I'm super psyched to be dealing with him anyway. And now he's watching through the whole thing, and he's not doing anything. He's just sitting there watching it. No reaction, no response. And then at the end of it, when it's over, he looks at me and he goes, "It's just like a movie." And I felt so good. That was one of the amazing moments of my life, is that I did the game for Spielberg's movie, and then I show Spielberg a videotape of a playthrough of the game, and he thinks it's just like a movie. And I just thought, yeah, I did it. Because that was a tremendous feeling of accomplishment, that I was right on target with what I had there. And so that was very cool.
Now, the movie E.T. was released around that same time in June of '82, I think. And I understand it wasn't even until July that the studios and Atari even reached a deal to even make the game adaptation. But did you guys know that it was going to be a game, or did you know before it was official that you were going to?
Well, nobody said anything, but I had told, when I was finishing up Raiders, I was in negotiations with one of the VPs there, who was kind of a doofus. He was trying to push me with stuff and do things around, and I just looked and I said, "Look," I said, "I'm just finishing off Raiders now, and I know you guys are going to want me to do E.T. next. So, let's just look at it from that point of view, see what's up." And he looked at me, he was like a little surprised, that I saw that. And I hadn't heard anything or knew anything, but I mean, of course, it's like, Raiders is a big movie, and E.T. is now the big movie that Spielberg put out. And if they had a movie game for one, of course, they want to do a game for the next. And odds are they'll want me to do it. So it's like, okay. And then when it turned out that there was only 5 weeks available to do the game, and that Spielberg had requested I do the game personally, then, that got to be a whole nother story.
Did you ever feel like you were in over your head during those 5 weeks?
Say it again?
Did you ever feel like you were, it was just completely impossible, and did you ever, did you try to urge them to extend the release date?
Not once. Not once. Never even occurred to me. There was a reason why the release date was September 1st. It was because that's all backtracking from manufacturing to be able to make it for the Christmas market, which was the number one thing. So trying to tell them to delay it was like saying, why don't we just miss some of the Christmas market? And their feeling was if they couldn't release it until late December, there's no point in doing the game. Because, their feeling is you have to strike with these things when they're hot, and this was it. This was the window. There was 5 weeks to do the game. That's all there was.
They were
adamant I never once thought, I can't do it. I totally had 100% confidence I could do it.
And they were just so adamant. And they were just so adamant about releasing it at Christmas. That was just sort of like from their standpoint, they didn't look at the time. It was just we needed it at Christmas. For the
which means actually releasing it before Thanksgiving. So it's sold through the whole Christmas marketing period. Right, and it took a certain amount of time to produce the game and manufacture it and get it set and distribute it and out to stores. So when you do all the math backwards from that, December 1st is the day you first need the ROM that you can start reproducing to get everything rolling.
Moving on a little bit, in 1983, of course, was the video game crash, and even over 30 years later, there was still a lot of debate about what exactly caused it. Some I even spoke to at work recently were saying it was E.T. specifically, but it seems like there was more than just. It seems like there was that E.T. was just like part of that whole puzzle that just sort of caused everything to crash down. What was your take working in the industry on why it all crashed?
Well, I mean, of course, ET was just a piece of it. It's not ET is not the reason the industry crashed. ET is a symptom of the reason the industry crashed. Have you seen the movie Atari Game Over?
If it's on Netflix, I have. And I
Yes, it's on Netflix. The
Think of
one
the name.
about the dig, but it's not just about the dig. It's a lot about ET and the industry and what happened, and how the industry grew, and how the industry fell. So a lot of that stuff is discussed in there. The reason I'm asking you this is because Manny Gerard, who was the number 2 guy at Warner Brothers at the time, he's the guy who acquired Atari for Warner. Okay? He was the Warner executive who was most closely associated with Atari. Okay? So what he says in the movie, he goes, the idea that E.T. killed the video game industry is just stupid. Right? I'm just quoting him. That's what he said. And I think that's true. What it is that the reason the crash occurred was because of the kinds of business practices that were going on at Atari. Atari was a vicious and brutal player in the market. They screwed anybody over they could when they could. And when you do that everywhere you can, what happens is if you start to lose your hold, if you start to lose your grip, everyone who can will jump back on you with both feet, right? So if you burn everybody on the way up, they're all waiting there with the torches and pitchforks when you start coming back down. You know, that's what happened to the video game industry. That's one part of it. There's 2 big pieces of it.
That philosophy of they'll burn you on the way back down. Atari wasn't really looking at innovating the hardware. I mean, they technically had the 5200.
Well, hang on, because that's part of
a joke.
the second part. Okay, the first part is that Atari's business practices set up a situation where as soon as they had any leaks, they were just going to blow up and fall apart. Okay, but the second part is, and this is one of the main things, the reason for the video game crash, the reason the game industry disappeared for a little while, is because it was the first product life cycle for a major game console. This was the first time it had ever happened, which means, you know, there's a guy at Atari, one of the programmers there, who used to say, you know what the definition of state-of-the-art is? State-of-the-art means when it's broke, nobody knows how to fix it, right? Which is a pretty cool concept, right? So, the thing is, the first life cycle, the first product life cycle, I mean, there were a lot of mistakes and problems that were made at Atari that no one knew were mistakes yet, right? Because this had never happened before. The idea that you don't have a licensing key, so other people can't just release games on your system without your approval. Atari didn't do that, right? Yeah. The idea of controlling who can release games on your system, the idea that when you've got a system going in the market, you should already be developing the next system. There were people at Atari who were saying that, but Atari didn't believe in it. Atari wasn't doing it. Atari was milking a cash cow. You know, nowadays, when people release a game system, they're already developing the next generation, right? That's always going, because they know that this game system is going to be good for a certain number of years, and then it's just going to sort of die out. It's not going to disappear immediately, but it's going to really start falling off. People won't be as interested. They'll have played most of the good games on it, and people are looking for something fresh. And they know that time period is about how long it takes to design a fresh system. So that idea of a product life cycle having an endpoint, they didn't have that concept. At Atari, this was a gold mine we discovered. And here it was, and it's a cash cow, and it's just throwing money at it. And there's nothing you can do to get out of the way. Okay? And this was going to go on forever. And nobody wanted to see it stop or believed it would stop. So they didn't understand the concept of a product life cycle. They didn't see the end coming and prepare for it. So when that happened, there were mad scrambles to try and throw something out into the market to try and keep the ball rolling. But they hadn't really planned and worked towards that, and they paid a big price for that. And no one really had, so the game industry kind of died. And that left the world with the question, because when games were really hot initially, there was the big question of, is this a fad or is this a new style of entertainment that's going to go on? People could have said the same thing about radio or television or any of these things when they first come out. And laser discs is a great example of something that, well, it was cool, it was interesting technology, but it didn't catch on. It was a fad. For a while, a lot of people had laser discs, and then they went away. Right?
Yeah.
So the same thing with this. Was it a fad or was something? Everybody who was involved in the industry knew that what we had done is create a new medium. This wasn't a fad. This was a new way to deal with TV in an entertainment fashion. And although Atari went away, games weren't done. The idea of playing video games on a TV, that was not going away. But there are a lot of people who thought it might. And so when there was a lull in the market, there were two kinds of people, right? There were people who go, oh, well, that's it. It was just a fad. It's over. It's another pet rock. Oh, well, what's the next thing? And there were other people who go, wow, Atari really blew it, and they lost track of the market, but this is a huge market, it's a huge industry, and we're going to pick it up and do it. And that's what Nintendo and Sega did, and they jumped in where Atari missed it.
Mm-hmm. You admit a quote you just said, and this is an unprepared question, so I don't know if I have all the facts. You mentioned how it's sort of a new medium, and sometime recently, I think Yars Revenge specifically was on display at the New York Art Museum as a piece of art.
Yeah. The Museum of Modern Art.
Yeah, and I think that in itself says that it is sort of art in the same way that television and film and writing can be art. So do you think that it just seems like that. The fact they're 30 years later, they're displaying your game as a modern piece of art. Does that make you feel like an artist instead of a programmer?
Oh, well, I don't know that you have to draw that distinction between artist and programmer. Yeah, I definitely feel like an artist, but I've always felt like an artist. It was hard for me to acknowledge myself as an artist. But, in addition to programming, I have written and I have produced and directed films, and I've put out books, and I've done a lot of different types of things, a lot of artistic endeavors, both literally and visually. But to have my work in the Museum of Modern Art was a tremendously validating and significant thing for me, personally, because it did really validate this idea of, I was always able to do technology, but I always saw myself kind of as an artist, but I struggled with the concept of really accepting myself as an artist, and now I'm much more comfortable with it. And, being literally an exhibiting artist for the Museum of Modern Art, it's hard to say you're not an artist if that's the case when you've got something like that.
Exactly.
Now, I can go online and I can look up exhibiting artists at MoMA, and there I am. It's really cool, right between Warhol and John Waters.
Well, yeah, and I take it there will be some other people over the years whose work like that will be shown off as art. Going back a little bit,
sure.
You'd mentioned, of course, the unlicensed games. The game. You guys didn't do anything to lock out unlicensed games, is what I'm meaning. And there was one company in particular.
No, there was no concept of that. There was no even because when Atari made this system, no one else. There wasn't an idea of anybody else would do anything for it. No, who's going to make stuff for our system? This is our system. There's never been anything like this that existed before, right? So we're doing this, and no one else is going to do it. We're the only ones who are going to do it if anybody wants it done. This whole idea of there might be other people doing it, that's not something you really get until you see it happen.
Well, one of the companies was Mystique, and they were known for doing sort of X-rated pornographic games. What was your, or even the other programmers' thoughts on that concept?
Oh, well, it was ridiculous. They called me up at one point. I talked with them. They wanted me to make one of their X-rated games for them. But, they didn't want to pay any money for it. They wanted to pay, bullshit for it. So I just told them, you guys are way in the wrong market. Then if you look at the quality of the games they ended up producing as X-rated games, well, that's what you get when you only pay that much for doing it. You know, you get what you pay for. Nobody who was a really good programmer on that system was going to do those kind of games for that kind of money when they could go to Atari or Activision or Magic and get paid real money to make video games.
I guess looking back, in just a general idea, what was sort of your thoughts on the legacy of both the 2600 and the games that you created?
Well, I mean, you know, I could look at that on several levels. I mean, if you mean like the legacy of video games from the late 70s, early 80s, you know, the legacy is establishing and pioneering a new medium, a whole new format. It's the beginning of virtual reality, things that are going to go on for years and years that are going to be defining aspects of how we deal with our lives are coming from video games. A lot of movie effects, all the great the CG effects and stuff that you see in movies, a lot of the 3D representation stuff came from video games, right? Video games is where that technology was really harnessed that then got used in some of these other media, right? Video games have enhanced now video games are an aspect of adolescence that you grow up with. Parents want to know, how should we deal with our kids around video games? It's a pervasive aspect of our society. And we were the people who took this from nothing to this new piece of society that's omnipresent. It's pervasive in people's lives. So that's the legacy. On one hand, we pioneered a new medium that's pervasive and that changes the way people think about their lives. It's something everyone is aware of, whether they play them or not. Everyone knows what video games are, and they know that people play them. People talk about the impact of them. I'm a psychotherapist now. Okay, I'm the Silicon Valley therapist. You know, and some of the things that I deal with are video game addictions, helping parents deal with what's going on with games, the questions they have about them developmentally, what impact do they have on people. These are questions you don't ask about jump ropes and things like that, right? It's become something that's fundamentally a part of the life development cycle. And that's a big thing to add, you know, to a world that, you know, 35 years ago, 40 years ago, those things didn't exist.
Well, on that note, what currently developing technology do you sort of think will be the centerpiece of that culture and lifestyle in a few years down the line?
Oh, I think video gaming and virtual reality are that element. I mean, that's what it is. They're going to take on new forms because, you know, the interfaces are going to get better, the way you deal with it gets better, the technology will improve. But the idea of a media that represents to you an environment that you can interact with and that you can engage in a fun way, in a learning way, in a meaningful way, you know, it's here. It's going to keep evolving. But I think, you know, it's already done. When you say, what is it going to become? What's the next thing? This is the next thing. You know, this is the thing, right? This is something that modifies the way people live their lives. The fact that you can use this technology to create games is just one aspect of what this technology brings to the human experience. And so when I look at it, that's the legacy. And so in a big picture, you know, the legacy is changing what the human experience on Earth is. I think we actually accomplished that by pioneering the medium of video games. On a more direct personal level, what's my personal legacy? Which I think is a fair question. You know, I come to really two things. One is Yars Revenge is a game that I believe created a lot of industry standards. I did a lot of things in Yars Revenge that were done for the first time that became industry standards. Pause mode, full screen explosions, right? Corollary materials to be released with a game, you know, backstory, comic books, things like that. There was a lot of stuff that I did in Yars Revenge that did not exist before Yars Revenge that became industry standard. And so I'm very proud of that legacy as having established and broadened the field I was in. The next thing is E.T. Okay? So E.T. is very significant in several ways. One is that of all the 2,600 games there were, E.T. is really the only one people still talk about, right? So I did a game in 5 weeks in like 8K of code that if you look at, because I always looked at games as a broadcast medium, okay? It's not just technology, it's a broadcast medium. And, what's the point of media? You're a writer, right? You understand media, right? And
yes.
you understand, to me, the idea of producing media is to generate interest and social discourse and consideration, right? I mean, a good piece of media entertains people. A great piece of media gets people to think and entertains, right?
Right.
So when you write an article, hopefully people are going to read it and they're going to really discuss it, or they're going to go on about it. It's going to generate social discourse, right? So 30 years after this machine is dead, a game that I did is still generating focus, interest, and social discourse. We're talking about it now, right? So that's a very powerful thing to do, in my opinion.
Exactly.
And so that's a legacy thing. The other great legacy for me, the thing is like E.T., people ask me, does it bother you if E.T. is the worst game of all time? I tell them quite honestly, I say, not only doesn't it bother me, I actually prefer that it is identified as the worst game of all time. I don't believe for a second that E.T. actually is the worst game of all time. There are worse games than E.T. But the thing is, as long as E.T. is identified as the worst game of all time, Yars Revenge is frequently identified as one of the best games of all time, right? So that means that I have the greatest range of any game designer in history. And I think that's a cool legacy to have, is to have the greatest range, right? One of my games is in the New York Museum of Modern Art, and another one of my games is the subflooring of the New Mexico desert. That's range. And I like having breadth and range. And so I feel I've really accomplished some very interesting things in my life with my game. And they're still coming around. They're still being talked about, still being examined. And, I'm proud to have produced a piece of media that had that kind of legs through time.
That really wraps up the interview. I really appreciate it.